Welcome back to the Goodol'boys channel. I'm showing you guys what's inside a case tiller today. Okay guys, so you can see we got the tiller apart here. Now I want you guys to notice the orientation of all the parts and just how it's put together. So this is the cover for the tines, obviously. This is a tractor, and everything that's laid out here is laid out in the exact orientation that it would be mounted up on the tractor. And notice the tractor is facing frontward. So the cover here is facing frontwards, the tines are facing frontwards. You'll notice that we have one solid longer tine, and then we have two separate smaller tines. This tine is for the left side, the two smaller tines are for the right side. And you'll notice that there's a difference because there's a difference in shaft length here. Now, obviously the sprocket is centered in the housing, and the housing is centered to these two pieces of metal here. So yeah, so obviously the longer side of the shaft is on the right side of the tractor when this is all put together. We've got our two cases here, and you'll notice inside of this one we do have a needle bearing here. It's missing the needle bearings part of the bearing there, but you get the point. There's one needle bearing there. Now the interesting thing was this is actually chain drive. You have one sprocket up top and this one sprocket on the bottom. When I took this apart, I was expecting to see a couple, 3 or 4 gears, but I don't know. In some ways the chain is better, in some ways it's not. Take the good with the bad. Honestly, I think the chain is actually a pretty good setup for this, because when the bearings go out, your shaft just wobbles all over the place, really wonky like, and you don't want to mess up a bunch of other gears. So honestly, the chain is probably better than gears if you're looking at it in that way. But nonetheless, that's what's inside of a case tiller, this part of it anyways. You also notice here that the hydraulic pump goes out to the left side, which is in line with the hydraulic valve on the left side as well. So it all kind of makes sense there. Now I did want to show you guys the bearings as well, because these are special bearings. So when you take one of these apart, you'll notice it's actually got a collar, and the bearing has a extra protruding part there. And again, everything's laid out in orientation. So you take this bearing and you can imagine it sliding onto here, and you know, it's going to sit about right here. The collar goes on the very outside, and that's just kind of how it works, and presses into the housing like that. Same with this side. When the bearing goes on here, it goes this way, so the collar goes on the outside. Now if you guys are looking to rebuild your tractor's tiller, this is a bearing that I got from Napa. There's your part number and the SKU number. So if you guys need to get bearings, Napa is the only place I could get them from, but that's your part number. Now, something that is actually special about these bearings that you don't notice unless you really know your stuff, if you look at this side on the inner race, you notice it's perfectly circular, which is exactly what you want, obviously. Now, if you take a look at this guy, you'll notice that the metal is thinner on this side than it is on this side, and that's for a reason. On the bearing, it's that same way too. So if you take a real close look here, you'll notice that this part of the bearing is thinner than this side. And the bearing is not out of round. You can see where they have machined this side down more than they have this side. And I guess they call this a lock collar. So when you're putting this together, you set the set screw on the shaft here, and when your bearings go out, or if the bearings are locked up, it prevents the inner race from spinning on your shaft. And that's pretty important, because if the bearing is locked up, this surface is going to get chewed up, and you do not want that. So there you go. That's what's inside of a case tiller. Hopefully you guys learned something. I know there's a few differences in some of these, so be careful with the part number on the bearing. Let me give you some measurements real quick. Okay guys, so here's your measurement, general measurement for the outer race there. I know it's hard to tell on camera as well, but here's the measurement for a shaft, and it's about 1 1/4. So that's basically the gist of what's inside a case tractor tiller. I am actually going to include some bonus footage here of me putting the tiller back together. Believe it or not, there's actually quite a few important steps when you're putting one of these things back together, and you guys might be surprised. So stick around, watch the bonus footage here. I also did want to add in here that if you guys love these case tractors as much as I do, there's going to be a whole playlist dedicated to the case tractors in the description box below, so go check it out. All right, here's the bonus footage. So just to make sure you guys understand what I'm trying to say here, the reason that the lock collar and the bearing is out of round a little bit is specifically so the inner race does not spin on your shaft. So the whole reason that these are out of shape is so the bearing doesn't spin. So I figured I would add some bonus footage for you guys here for some stuff that might not be exactly obvious. So first of all, I went ahead and filed down the shaft so the bearing is able to slip on and off. I did this on both sides. Obviously, you want to put some kind of grease on the inside of all of the spots where the bearings are going to go. Just like so. And this is going to help you get the bearing pressed in. Now, before you press the bearings in, at least on this one side, what you want to do here is go ahead and put your shaft through here. Get the chain all set up first. Okay? Because once your bearing is in this side, you're not going to be able to get the chain on this shaft. So, like I said, you need to have the shaft through here with the chain on it before you put the bearing in here. And then you can go ahead and put the bearing on there, and you have to press the bearing in while the chain is on this shaft. Another little tip here, I take the outer race of the old bearing and use it to kind of tap the new bearing in here. And this should not take very much force. If your bearing is going into the hole nice and straight, then you shouldn't have any problem getting it slide in. And of course, you do want to clean up all your surfaces. That's one thing I didn't mention as well. I cleaned up the inside of the casting where the bearing goes. It had a little rust, dirt, and debris on it, so I cleaned it up with a little bit of emery cloth or sandpaper. So our bearing is all the way pressed in. You guys can see it's flush with the front of the case here. And if you look on the inside, you can see why it's so important to put the shaft in here with the chain on it before you press this bearing in. Just because once you get the bearing in, you're never going to be able to get the chain back on this sprocket here because of, well, the tightness of the chain is one thing. Unless you have a really slacked out chain, you might be able to get the chain back on here, but you should not have a slacked out chain. And then the other thing here is you can see just how close the chain and sprocket is to the outside of the case. So this thing is built so that the chain never comes off inside here. So like I said, that's one of the main points of putting this back together. Just make sure you have the shaft back in here with the chain on the cog before you press the bearing in. So guys, if you press the bearings in both the cases and you don't have the chain on the sprocket, there is actually another way. You can put a quick connect on the chain. I actually just didn't want to do this. I didn't want to have another point for failure or something else that could possibly fall apart once the thing's put back together. So I just put the chain on the sprocket before I pressed the bearing in. But again, like I said, you can possibly have a quick connect on the chain that will allow you to put the chain on after all the bearings are pressed in. Another part of putting this back together is making sure that all the needles are back in your needle bearing or just in the right position. You guys could see in the video that there were no needle bearings in there, and that's unfortunately because they all fell out. They didn't have any grease on them. The surfaces do look good though, no scoring, no pitting, so The bearing's fine, it just needs greased up and put back together. So what we're gonna do here to help us out some is put a little bit of grease on the inside of this bearing, and we're gonna take a pair of needle nose pliers, and one by one we're gonna take the little needle bearings and put them back in here, straight up and down. Okay guys, so all the needle bearings are back in there. This is the other side of the case. You can see our chain side and hydraulic motor sides over there. I went ahead and pressed this bearing in on this side already. Now before you go ahead and put these cases together, you just want to make sure that your surfaces are nice and clean. We do have a gasket on there, and you want to make sure you got some fresh grease on the chain, which I've already done that, but I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more just for good measure. You can never have enough grease on these kinds of things. Also make sure you get your little output shaft of the motor. That's what actually rides on the needle bearing on the inside of this case housing. You want to wipe your shaft down one more time. Put some grease on there where the bearing's going to go. All right, once everything is ready to go back in place, just take your case and slide it right on here. Okay, that's it. It's basically back together. Okay guys, so this is where we put the tines on. So like I said in the video before, I actually have these tines laid out so they're in the exact orientation as they were when they came off. Like I said, these are the tines. I already know that this tine is going to go on the tiller shaft right about here. I'm gonna go ahead and slide this guy on here, match up the hole. Now, these are the pins that I was talking about needing to grease. And really, like I said, you need to grease the shaft and the pins because, like I said, these will freeze onto the shaft and then you'll never be able to get them back off. So, grease the pins really good. And then you can go ahead and put your cotter pin back in it. Screw this guy on. And like I said, it's going to be the same procedure for every single one of these. Just grease the pin, grease the shaft, and put it together. Have a longer set of tines. All right, so what we're looking at here is pretty much the complete unit minus the cover for the tines. There's nothing else really to it. For the cover, we have 4 more bolts that go in these spots, and it's done. As you guys can see, the tiller's all the way back together. Hopefully this video was helpful or useful to you guys in some way. If you stayed this far and watched this long, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Check out the description box below. There are lots of other case tractor videos down there, including how to put ag tires on these things, lots of other useful tips like oil filters, air filters, that kind of stuff. So again, go check it out, all in the description box below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next video. Peace. Woo!
It's all about humanity.